Wouldn't it be nice to be able to predict the future with some kind of accuracy? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Canada. You're listening to Canadian Intelligence, eh? A series of podcasts about all things related to national security. So, centuries ago, the ancient Greeks and the Romans would kill an animal and they would look at its intestines, its entrails, to try to figure out what was going to happen tomorrow. Thankfully, things have advanced a little bit since those times. I don't think killing animals is acceptable, certainly not to the Humane Society of Canada, for one thing. But there's always this great interest amongst people in determining what's going to happen tomorrow, whether it's your stock price or perhaps who you should marry in life, or how your kids will turn out, or how your favorite sports team is going to do. But there is an actual profession out there which we call strategic forecasting. And to help us understand this industry of strategic forecasting, I'm absolutely delighted to invite to the podcast a friend and colleague of mine, Minke Meijnders, who is a Dutch citizen. She is here in Canada, working sort of with me at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute Security, Economics, and Technology program, where she teaches a course in strategic forecasting. She's a former research fellow at the Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands, which is a leading think tank I've been following for quite some time. And as I said, she's teaching a course for the program for which I'm a director at the University of Ottawa on strategic forecasting. So Minke, welcome to the podcast.
Well, hi, Phil. It's good to be here. Thank you for the very kind introduction.
Oh, I'm thrilled that we're finally doing this. So let's start with basic principles, Minke. What do you define as strategic forecasting? So in the courses that you teach at University of Ottawa, what is the general theoretical notion behind strategic forecasting?
Well, I think first of all, Phil, it's important. Words are important here. So we use the term strategic foresight because it's really not about forecasting or predicting the future. We don't have like a crystal ball to magically look into the future, right? Or
if only we did, right? If only we all had a crystal ball.
And to look into animals, that's something definitely not a method we use. No, I never heard about that, to be honest. I'm going to use it in the course, I guess. So foresight, what it is.
Don't use it in the class. You get all kinds of complaints if you bring animals into class and start dissecting them, Minke, without authority. There's a good chance you'll get fired. So please don't do that.
Okay, I withdraw that. Sorry. But foresight then really is about like exploring plausible futures, right? So it's definitely not about predicting or forecasting it, but we really try to look at what could potentially happen and what are the potential challenges and opportunities that emerge from those futures. So. And then when we talk about strategic foresight, then we really talk about like a more of an organized, systematic way where we look into the future. We try to deal with the complexity and the uncertainty. The future holds. So that's what we mean when we talk about strategic foresight. Strategic foresight, is already quite. Sorry, Phil.
No, go ahead. Please, go ahead.
No, yes, strategic foresight is something that we do quite use for quite some time already. It started with the Shell company, like an oil company that used it back in the 70s to actually foresee the oil crisis back at the time. So that was really a pioneer in using scenario analysis, for example. But we do see that more and more companies are using it. Yeah, they did. They actually, and I think they're still one of the companies that it really has like a dedicated foresight department, which is something we as foresight users are really, it's an example for all of us. But you do also see that now in like the more of the public sector, it's being used more and more often as well, and especially because of the pandemic, it's you do see a renewed interest there.
Mm-hmm. We'll get to the pandemic in a bit, Minke. So, if I understood you correctly, because of course Shell is a Dutch company, so the Netherlands really has been at the forefront of the strategic foresight industry, based on your experience.
It is, but it's definitely only in the Netherlands. And my experience is more within the public sector, and there you see that also countries like Canada or like countries like Singapore, for example, do have a very established way and proven way of using strategic foresight in their policy making processes. So that's it's definitely not that the Netherlands invented strategic foresight. I don't want to to put it like that.
It's okay. You're allowed to express pride in your people. I also want to pick up a little bit, Minke, before we move on this use of the word strategic, because of course, in my background in intelligence, we looked at strategic and tactical intelligence. So strategic was more looking at the bigger picture, maybe a little bit down the road, whereas tactical, the way that we use the term, referred to specific operations, specific investigations, where you're trying to find out really important details. So, for example, when I worked in counterterrorism, you want to find out, who are the important players? What are they doing? Are they acquiring ammunition? Are they acquiring explosives? Are they doing any attack planning? So, from your perspective, the use of the term strategic in terms of foresight, is there such a thing as tactical foresight as well, or is that a term I'm just making up right now?
Well, I love that you're making up entire new fields, but it's no, no, no. It's. I think it's the word strategic really means something, right? We want to, by looking at plausible different futures, we try uh, to identify different policy options, for example, right? So it's not enough to only know what are the important players and to know current trends, but we are very curious about what possibilities do we have in the future. For example, if you develop several scenarios about the future of the world order, for example, that's a big one, right? It's a big question, but what you try to do with it is
Yeah,
actually well, that's the type of questions we actually work with. So that's, or for example, the future of the conflict in Syria, for example, right? That's those are the type of questions
right.
that you try to tackle. What you try to do with it is really engage policymakers in that discussion. You try to have a discussion with them. What do you think are the key drivers here? What do you think are the driving forces of the future? And then step by step try to get to different scenarios. But scenarios are not an end in itself. It's not that when we have
Mhm.
those beautiful written scenarios that we're done. What you try to do is identify policy options for all of these four scenarios, and maybe also look at the current assumptions we do have in our policy making. Are they still valid? And if they're only valid in one or two of the scenarios you develop, you might want to reconsider those, right? So that's what we mean with
Mhm.
strategic. In the end, we try to really provide more strategic options in the end. So that's different from tactical, I believe. So, but maybe we can
Right.
have another
Uh,
quote on tactical.
no, that that's interesting and I think you're absolutely right. I think the use of the word strategic here is deliberate. You are looking at something beyond the here and now. I mean, the word foresight alone, right, is indicating that you're looking at something that has yet to take place, and trying to figure out ways to develop tools, which we'll get to in a second, about how can one be best prepared. As you said, this is not an exact science, but there's a series of things you can do to try and come up with potential scenarios, rank them, I suppose, according to their probability and maybe in terms of importance, in terms of their possible impact. Scenarios A, B, C, and D, looking at what's the worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario. So, in the teaching that you've done at Ottawa U and the work you've done in the Clingendael in the past, Minke, what are some of the tools that you use or have developed to try to get people to understand this concept and actually implement a type of strategic foresight?
Well, first of all, there are like a plethora of methods you can use. But core things we used were scenarios. We already touched upon that a bit, the scenario methodology, but also things like, for the ones who don't know, like scenarios are like stories of plausible future environments, right? So And again, that's not really about predicting a certain scenario, but you want to explore
Mm-hmm.
plausible scenarios there.
Mm-hmm.
But other things we used, for example, were horizon scanning. And horizon scanning is very much about trying to detect weak signals or signals that could potentially indicate a disruption for your future or future threat landscape. So maybe to give you an example, I don't know if we have time for that, but we had developed a horizon scan national security back in the Netherlands because there was an
Mm-hmm.
kind of a
Oh,
need
really?
to yeah, there was a we do have like we probably do have as well, right, a national risk assessment which you do maybe every 4 or 5 years, but it's not something you update yearly. But there was a need because the world is changing so fast and it's so complex that you want to scan more
Mm-hmm.
regularly on new things, things that are emerging on the horizon, which are not necessarily a threat at the moment, but could, if you're not, could in the end maybe develop in a threat to national security. So that's why we set up a Horizon Scan national security. We did that on 5 different themes, so for example, on international economics, international politics, etc. And horizon scanning is really basically it comes down to scanning a large amount of resources, a large amount of data, and it's not like browsing the media, right? That's what we all do, but you'd really try to do it in more of a systematic way.
Mm-hmm.
We really try to put like the experts we had and the knowledge they have central, but you want to develop sort of a protocol where they have to scan all the material, but you try to do that in a structured way, but also try to limit their biases because that's what we're all prone to, I guess. Maybe looking at things that you already think are
Mm-hmm.
going to happen, right? But that's not the purpose of scanning. The scanning is really meant to maybe see things that you're not expecting yet, or that's not on the radar yet of policymaking. So that's what we do now yearly. We do a large scan on 5 themes. Yeah, and that really serves as yeah, try as a check if you still have the right topics at hand for your national risk assessment. If there's anything popping up that you might want to monitor more closely, or you want to develop scenarios on. And I think that's a prime example of how you can have develop a foresight tool, strategic foresight tool that is one of your building blocks of trying to understand the future a bit better, to be better prepared at the end.
Mm-hmm. You raise an interesting potential problem here, in that given my past working in national security in Canada, and dealing an awful lot with my Dutch counterparts at the IVD, one of the best security services I've ever dealt with in the past, and still have many friends that work there. In that world, of course, a lot of the information you're referring to, this large gathering of information, would not be publicly available information. It would be intelligence, so it would be
Mhm.
secret or higher. Did that complicate matters when you tried to do these national risk assessments, that you had some actors with access to classified information and some who didn't, or was there a way to get around that?
It did. Of course it did, because the IVD was part of our horizon scanning team as well. And they do indeed have access to things that they can't even share. And the goal was to have a report that's publicly available. So, yeah, we had to ask them to disregard that. No, maybe not disregard, but that's not something you wanted to put up in a public report. Everything that we do, and that's
Right.
I think Netherlands is kind of an exception on this, is that our national risk assessment is something that the whole world can see. So it's of course there are some
Mm-hmm.
backgrounders only for eyes of specific people, but in the end, yeah, the goal is of the from the Netherlands to also have the public engaged in your national security debate. So that's a key reason to only use open source data. Yeah.
I must say that, going back to the mid 2000s, when I first was introduced, my first trip to The Hague to meet with the IVD, I was always quite impressed that the agency was putting out regular reports, unclassified, but based on some of their knowledge, which I'm sure was derived from investigations, on things like Salafi jihadism in the Netherlands. And these were readily available on the website. I mean, like I said, the public could read them. And the Netherlands was decades ahead of us here in Canada. We're finally getting to that point here in Canada. The more recent public reports that Public Safety Canada puts out on behalf of CSIS, the RCMP, are getting a little more interesting because in the past they were terrible. They weren't saying anything. So, I mean, I tip my hat, literally, to the IAVD and to the Dutch government for doing this. So Minke, let's move on to the example, of course, that everyone is talking about today, and that's COVID-19. We're still dealing, us here in Ontario, province of Ontario, with almost a complete shutdown. I haven't seen, well, I guess I saw you in person a few months ago when we went to the museum, the War Museum, to look at the Anne Frank exhibit. Um, in your course, you do talk about COVID, and you do talk about it as a great example on how if a little better strategic foresight had been put in place, we may have been better in a better position to deal with it. Can you walk my listeners through how you use the COVID example in your course to demonstrate the usefulness and the utility of strategic foresight?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, there's been a major debate whether COVID-19 was a failure of the foresight community. And on one hand, it was, and one hand, it wasn't. Because for a very long time, the foresight community has already warned for a pandemic also of this size to happen. Um, for example, in the national risk assessment of the Netherlands, it's ranked in the top five of national security risks. It's yeah, not surprisingly for the Netherlands. The first risk is flooding, so that's still very high in our rankings. But the second biggest threat to national security has always been a pandemic, or for at least the past reports we published. So it's definitely not something that wasn't on our radar. We did scenario exercises on that. We estimated the impact on all the national security interests. We estimated the probability of it. So it was on our radar. It's not something that came as a surprise to us. And also in countries like the UK or the US, the intelligence services warned for a pandemic for quite a long time already. So in that way, it was not
Mhm.
a failure of the foresight community. But in another way, you have to look at yourself critically, I think, as somebody who engages in strategic foresight, because clearly the signals or the warnings weren't taken up by the ones that should have done something with it. So that's uh,
Mm.
I do think that we do see that yeah, there we have to make sure that there's a more effective uptake of strategic foresight and really translate it into to policy making. Um, you do see now that strategic foresight is being seen as something apart from policy making. It's often done as like a standalone activity where you do one scenario exercise, for example, or one big horizon scan. But you want to make sure it actually fits into the policy making process better, I guess, than it has been in the past years. Um, because it's hard, right? You want to make sure you are actually doing stuff that yeah, are actually with a clear policy making purpose in mind. You want to deal with or align your work with the struggles that policymakers are also struggling with. So there's a need to better align those two. So yeah, in a way, it has been a failure of foresight, not so much the content of foresight, but the place it has, I guess, in our in the way we draft policies. Because it's hard thinking about the future, Phil. It's not something that comes naturally to a lot of people. It's yeah, the pressures of short term thinking to meet the political demand is often stronger than longer term thinking. So that's definitely something we need to better ourselves. And there's a task for us.
You raised a lot of good points there, and I've always said that the best information can be made available to policy and decision makers. They may choose not to act on the information. I can speak personally from an intelligence perspective. We've been talking about terrorism and the likelihood of a successful terrorist attack in Canada for decades, and were largely ignored until it happened. And we
until
had
it
two
happened.
attacks in 2014, two days apart. So is it a problem? Is it too much information? Is it information overload? As you said, there's short-term thinking. You go to any senior official, and I mean, I remember my limited time at Public Safety Canada, trying to get a meeting with somebody senior, and you look at their agendas, and they're meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. So, is there a better way to get people's attention to these issues, or so that's the first question, and the second one is: are there simply events that end up being so huge in terms of their impact and takes some unpredictable paths that even the best strategic foresight is not in the end going to make a lot of difference in terms of our ability to manage those incidents? Does that make
Uh,
sense?
that makes sense. Yeah, excellent, excellent, but also big questions to answer. The first one definitely, yeah, having strategic foresight. I think he is engaging those policy makers into your strategic foresight process, right? So it's not, you should not just simply present your horizon scan report, because then it will land on their desk,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody is ever going to look at it again. So you want to make sure you have the policymakers yeah, engaged in the process. So when you do scenario exercises, for example, you want them to be part of the discussion. What are the key driving forces of this future, for example? So you make sure you have that buy-in of policymakers, and that's a choice, because you do need resources for that. People do need to make time for it, but that's the only way I believe that you yeah, are able to make it, to internalize it within your organization or within your department. So it's, for example, what we did with the Horizon Scan National Security. The scan itself was done by experts, because that's a lot of work. You have to go through a lot of resources, so you don't want to uh, have people that pain we took care of. But what we did was, when we actually had like a sort of a medium list with potential threats, we invited policymakers to actually have discussion with us, and yeah, ask their opinion about the potential impact on national security. And then we came up with the things that were really important for them. And then you saw that they, yeah, that it was actually useful for them as well, and that way you make sure it's part of the bigger strategic cycle. That's not the only thing. You also need structures, you need the right people, you need the right processes in place. So there's a lot of work to be done there,
Mm-hmm.
and really
So
just, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
no, I was going to say, so it really is. You have to get them to understand the usefulness of this process, the very integral role that they play, as you said, rather than just throw this document on their desks. If they're part of the process, I
Hmm.
mean, one would assume they want to read, something of which they were part, and they all have their own particular piece of the puzzle, their own experiences and expertise that they can contribute to the forecasting method in the first, or sorry, the foresight method in the first place, right?
A good field, yeah, really. Foresight, indeed. Yeah, true. And you have to make them a bit acquainted with the methods as well, because there's, what I noticed, there is people are used to using quantitative data, but the methods and the tools we have, people are a bit uncomfortable with it. We use like
Mm,
narratives, we use scenarios, we use much
yeah.
more qualitative data, right? And that's something we noticed, that yeah, people are just not that comfortable with it yet. So you have to make sure they are. And another key point is, I guess, a lot of these issues are yeah, cutting across different departments. So it's not sufficient to only talk with the Ministry of Defense, or to only talk with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Mm,
Um, yeah, a lot of these issues are cutting across these different departments. So that needs kind of cultural change as well, and that's where we started doing that back in the Netherlands. We had sessions with all those ministries taking part, because reality, Phil, and probably same in Canada, is that those are still very organized in silos. Is still organized and
Hmm.
focused on their own departments, and
Yeah.
that's another key challenge to tackle here
Hmm.
as well. Especially now, you do see that,
Hmm.
for example, COVID, but is not only a public health matter, right? It's
Yes.
larger than that.
So let's pick up on COVID then, Minke. You use COVID as one of the examples in the course you're teaching at Ottawa U, and I'll put a link to your course and to other courses that when the podcast is published. Um, you're right. We've been warning about pandemics for a long time. I mean, even Hollywood. My God, how many Hollywood films are there about? I remember one with Dustin Hoffman a couple of years ago. I forget, maybe 20 years ago, about worldwide pandemics that kill all kinds of people, and there's no vaccination, et cetera, et cetera. This is an unfair question to ask you because we're still in the midst of COVID, obviously. Although it's, like knock on wood, we are getting more vaccinations here in Canada. I understand the Netherlands is doing quite well too. I read in the Dutch news that vaccinations are doing well, and hopefully we can return to whatever the new normal is going to be. Again, unfair question, but is there any one or two major lessons learned that you've been able to identify based on the COVID? It's 15 months and counting right now. We've been dealing with COVID. That strategic foresight um, may have put us in a better position to handle, or is it simply too early to tell at this point?
It's not true. No, you have to look critically to your own assessments as well, of course. So in this scenario exercise we did on the in like a pandemic type of scenario, we largely underestimated the effect of the international effects it would have. We focused very much on what would be the
Mm,
effect on the Dutch national economy, what would be the effect of the daily lives of Dutch
right.
citizens, but we largely underestimated. Yeah, the possibility even that the EU borders would be closed, that uh, the
Mm,
function of the EU was even questioned at that time, right? So that's something we underestimated, or we neglected at grossly. We have to admit that. Other
mhm,
effects we were, kind of, it's the effect on public health and economy were estimated pretty decently, but yeah, other factors we just maybe too big to imagine in the end, and
mhm,
that's something we could have done better, I guess. Yeah, for sure. Um,
mm. You just used an interesting phrase there. Some things are too big to maybe get your head around. Do you think that I agree with you? The utility of strategic foresight is a great series of tools, and we should do more of it. Do you think that okay, we're again, knock on wood, we're drawing to hopefully the end of the major phase of COVID. Again, obviously things can change, but I think people are expressing more confidence now than they have in months, which is good. Confidence is a good thing. Do you think that a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, this will be yeah, what was COVID again? I forget. Wasn't that some kind of a? I mean, it's human nature to forget things. It's human nature to put things to the side and move on with our lives. Do you ever fear that we don't learn our lessons by not doing better strategic foresight, and so we find ourselves in the same boat down the road where had we done taken the time, put in the energy, devoted the resources to these things, we could maybe handle future scenarios better? Or are we destined as humans simply to keep repeating the errors of our ways? I hate to be so negative and pessimistic, but
yeah, that's
I'm
not
curious
how
what
I
you
know
what
you,
you would say in
Phil.
that regard.
That's not how I know you. It's yeah, of course, it's human nature that we do very much see that this is a reflex of people. Right now we want to better prepare for the next pandemic, but the threat actually is that they are focusing very much on public health issues, uh, whilst we do see other major things coming, like for example the climate crisis, right? And that's something where we should focus on
Mm-hmm.
as well. So the danger here is that we might focus our efforts too much on this specifically, and not keep our eyes open for other things that are still coming our way. So it's yeah, I do share your feeling there that probably we'll be probably kissing each other again by saying goodbye. We will probably hug each other again, right? So it's human nature to go back to that. I don't know. Is that a Canadian thing? We Dutch do. We say we hug and kiss when we say goodbye.
I was going to say, you Dutch with the 3 kisses. I don't know about this. You guys have invented the kissing on the cheek, so you're going to be in a big heap of trouble if that very Dutch tradition is no longer going to be available.
So yeah, I'm so sorry. We have to reinvent that whole or greeting protocol. But it's yeah, I agree that probably will go back to some of to most of it. But yeah, for us as strategic foresight community, it's our job to maybe take this window of opportunity we have to actually, because when you actually are able to have a specific process in place, and you make it part of your policy making process, then it's much harder to disregard it, and then it's part of your more of your culture, so to say. It
Yeah.
demands a change that doesn't come overnight. So yeah, maybe we should take this opportunity uh, and make it part of our yeah, thinking in the general way. If that makes sense.
I, it will make sense to me, and it makes sense to you. And I know that the courses that you've been teaching for us at the University of Ottawa have been oversubscribed. So clearly, there's an interest in learning more about this. But I just want to. I was going to end, Minke, by asking you to tell me the Lotto 649 numbers, but that would just be a bad joke. This has been a fascinating conversation on an issue that actually has some serious national security implications, which is what I normally talk about. I mean, I'm usually talking about terrorism and things like that, but if there hasn't been a significant effect to international national security than COVID, then I can't think of one. Like you said, it's not so much that we're dealing with, bombs going off in shopping malls or whatever, but we're dealing with millions of dead, incredible effects to our economy on a global scale. And so I just want to say thank you for taking the time today to walk my listeners through what is strategic foresight, what it's good for, and I think more importantly, to spread the word that, as you said in your just recently, this should become part of what we do on a regular basis. This should not just be, an asteroid is going to hit the Earth. Let's do strategic foresight on where it's going to hit. It should be part of almost like the blood and the bones, I think, of what senior policy and decision makers do on a regular basis. They seem to have done that in the Netherlands, and you're bringing your skill set here to Canada to help with us. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for making time. It was a great conversation. It's I think the Netherlands and Canada is very much alike in that way. So yeah, there's a lot to learn from. We do learn a lot from how your Canadians are having a dedicated strategic foresight department. So yeah, it's good to have friends who engage in strategic foresight. So thank you for the conversation.
Well, and as you and I have, both know, and many both know, the Dutch-Canadian relationship is one of the strongest that's out there for all kinds of reasons. So yeah, let's hope that this moves forward. So that was my conversation with Minke Meijnders. As I said, please register for the course she's teaching at the University of Ottawa. There'll be a link at the end of this podcast. What do you think about strategic foresight? Do you practice it? Is it a good idea? Love to hear your feedback. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisAge. You'll also find me on LinkedIn and Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more, go to the website, borealisthreatrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You get a free daily digest, all the podcasts, all the blogs, perspectives today in terrorism. You'll also find a link to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, The History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present, available only on my website. Love to hear what you think of the podcast and of the other content. Drop me a line. We'll talk soon. Until then, stay safe.